So I think Italy is, to a large degree, in my opinion, a post-democracy in this sense.
To you who have been born in Italy, God has allotted, as if favouring you specially, the best defined country in Europe. Those words were written by Giuseppe Mazzini in his essay Duties of Country. Mazzini believed that Italy was united by geography and language, and that through unification, Italians would gain the power to improve their economic and social conditions. Today, Italians are united by language and geography, but they are dissatisfied and disillusioned with their politics. The recent elections saw the lowest turnout of any Italian election, and the victory of the Fratelli d'Italia, led by Giorgia Meloni, who is poised to become the next Italian Prime Minister and the first woman to hold that position. Centrists and Social Democrats in Italy spent the campaign warning of the dangers of a right-wing coalition led by Meloni and accused her and her party of having fascist sympathies. This week, we spoke to Alessandra Bocchi, a journalist, and Thomas Fazi, a writer for Unheard, about what the right-wing coalition will do in government, the fascist accusations against Meloni and the Fratelli d'Italia, the future of the Italian left, and the legacy of Mario Draghi, the outgoing Prime Minister. For our Patreon subscribers, there is an extended conversation on Italy's relationship with the European Union. We hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to subscribe for the full extended conversation.
So thank you very much to Thomas Fazi and Alessandra Bocchi for joining us for this conversation on the Italian election result that came in late last night for us, Wednesday for you now when we are going to release this. So the big headline grabber is the right triumph. But among all the commentaries about the alleged return on fascism, I think more substantially the question should be, how can we explain this right-wing surge in Italy? Has Italy become a right-wing country of the past 4 or 5 years? Is it only kind of a tactical result with the electoral system favouring the broad right-wing coalition between Berlusconi, Salvini and Meloni? Or is it just maybe perhaps that the Italians want something new, anything new?
Well, yeah, I think it's the last point you touched. I think that's really the crucial point. It's easy to look at Meloni's victory and to think that Italy is shifting to the right, as a lot of analysts and a lot of commentators are saying. In fact, let's start with. I mean, everyone's talking about this great success that she's had. All right. In fact, I mean, if we look at the numbers, she won 26% of the votes. Of course, that's a huge increase from the 4.4% that she had just 4 years ago in the last national elections in 2018. So clearly, Meloni has done a good job in boosting support for her party. But I think it's to understand, the kind of underlying shifts in Italian society. It's important to ask ourselves, where are those votes coming from? So if we look, for example, I mean, first of all, let's take the percentage, 26%. That's a big percentage, but it's not much compared to what the Five Star Movement got 4 years ago. Almost 33%. So again, we see that yes, clearly she's got a lot of support, but she's got way less support than the Five Star Movement had just 4 years ago. But I think even more interestingly, if we look at overall, I mean, percentages don't really give us a clear, picture of what's going on here. I think overall numbers are much more interesting. So if we look at, for example, the overall votes that the centre-right coalition got this time around. So that's the Meloni's Brothers of Italy, Salvini's Lega, and Berlusconi's Forza Italia. They collectively won pretty much the same number of votes that they won in 2018. So just over 12 million votes. So again, we don't see a huge shift to the right. If we look at the coalition, centre-right coalition as a whole, pretty much almost the exact number of votes they got 4 years ago. So clearly, that's already enough, I think, to understand that there's not much of a right-wing shift going on in terms of Italians' voting preferences. So what we're witnessing really is pretty much a reshuffling of votes within the centre-right coalition and among centre-right parties. So what Meloni has done is that she's bled a huge number of votes, not so much from other parties, definitely not from the the non-voters, which is something we'll probably be talking about, but mostly from other parties. So mostly from the Lega and from Forza Italia. So that's really what's going on here. Now, these votes having shifted from what could be considered a slightly more moderate party like Forza Italia to Brothers of Italy to Meloni. Does that indicate, kind of a radicalization of this electorate? I don't think so, frankly. And the Lega could be seen as just as radical, and in fact, maybe more radical, or at least what the Lega used to be in 2018. With its strong Eurosceptical, anti-Euro rhetoric. In many ways, that was a much more populist party than Meloni is, which in many respects is actually more moderate, especially when it comes to kind of the big macroeconomic issues, and especially when it comes to the EU, than the Lega was. So I think really it's that voters, the centre-right voters, really didn't see that they had much of a choice. Really, the Lega, for a number of reasons, Salvini for a number of reasons, has really lost credibility in the eyes of a lot of centre-right voters. Berlusconi is seen kind of a bit as a bit of a dead horse in the eyes of many. So really, I think it shouldn't be seen as a vote so much for Meloni, really, or for anything that Meloni represents. Let's put it that way. I think it really is, a vote that is born out of what is seen as a lack of alternatives. This idea that it's just her turn now. But I think that the major point that I think people need to understand is this is a reshuffling within centre-right votes. She hasn't. I mean, and interestingly, the same goes for the Partito Democratico, kind of centrist, neoliberal party, which also got more or less the same votes that it got 4 years ago, slightly less, but not that much. So what we have is two major blocks: the centre-right bloc and the nominally centre-left bloc, which have really which have a consolidated base, which has more or less remained, I would say, largely unchanged since 2018. The big change is the massive drop in the votes for the Five Star Movement, which lost 6.5 million votes just over 4 years. And in fact, 6 million votes is more or less the difference in votes between the 2018 elections and these elections. So what we have really is just, the only real difference compared to 2018 is the huge number of voters that, had placed their hopes in the Five Star Movement and have abandoned that party without finding an alternative, not even in Meloni's party.
So, Alessandra, is this just simply a case of disillusion and the Italian electorate finding the next toy it has to express its dissatisfaction? Or is there partly a kind of more substantial right-wing shift also down there somewhere?
I think both. They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, Thomas is definitely correct in analyzing the electoral results. I mean, compared to 2018, the center-right coalition has now 44% approximately, and in 2018 it had somewhere around 37.5%. So it's not a significant change. However, it is significant that Giorgia Meloni's party went from having 4% or 5%, which was barely enough to be represented in parliament, to now having 26%. That's a huge surge. And yes, she was the only party in the opposition. So, of course, it was very easy for voters who were dissatisfied to say, okay, who do we vote for if we're not happy with how things are going? And they're going to vote for her. But also I think they were comfortable enough voting for her. Whereas I spoke to many people who previously said, she's too right wing. I feel uncomfortable with her, the fascist roots of her party, to now being comfortable voting for her. And it's not that much of an issue anymore. So I think both of those.
Thomas, you want something to say about this?
Yeah, no, just very briefly. I mean, I think, Alessandra definitely has a point there. I think just two very brief points. Well, firstly, I would say that it's true that a lot of people, saw Meloni as being too radical maybe some years ago, and they don't, see it that way anymore. I think that's also part of the fact that Meloni has, kind of normalized her position a lot. And we know that she's, pledged allegiance based, in quite explicit, in a quite an explicit manner, towards the European Union, towards the US, NATO, transatlantic, Atlantic alliance, and has really gone out of her way to kind of present herself as this responsible pro-establishment figure. So I think that's also, that I think that also plays an important role. I think that a lot of people have felt more comfortable voting for her, also because they do see her as much less radical than she was just a few years back. And yes, of course, I think it was a vote against the kind of Draghi coalition to a large degree. That's definitely true. But again, I think it was mostly voters from the centre right that as I said earlier, turn towards her. I mean, so it's those even more moderate centre right voters, so even Forza Italia voters, that clearly even they weren't happy with Draghi's kind of, I would say, techno-authoritarian approach to government. But I think it's also important to note that this wasn't enough. That even the fact that she was the only party in opposition, the numbers clearly show that wasn't enough to capture the vote of Italy's, more angry and more disillusioned underclasses that previously voted for the 5-star.
No, I was just going to say I completely agree with that. But we also don't know where the reshuffling, whether there's just been a reshuffling of votes or whether some votes came from other parties like the 5-star movement, which has halved its electoral successes from 2018. So I think that's significant as well.
Yeah, just sort of to bring up on this. So, Alessandra, we've talked a little bit about the right so far, but what about the state of the opposition? The Enrico Letta has already resigned following the defeat in the election yesterday. What's next for the Party Democratia and also for the movement 5 Stars after this election result?
Well, I think the 5-star movement just relies on its promises of a universal basic income, which is especially attractive in the South, where it has most of its supports. The PD government is essentially just an establishment safe vote, so to speak. It's just the vote that people give when they're too scared of the alternatives. It's not really representative of anything more than being pro-EU, neoliberalism, sort of moderate neoconservative agenda abroad. It doesn't really represent anything significant. And the 5-star movement is what was born so much as a radical party that it ended up not really standing up for anything at all. So that's, I would say, the state of the opposition. But maybe Thomas has something to add as well.
No, I mean, I can only agree with this very bleak assessment of the opposition. I mean, as as someone that comes from the left, I'm even, I find I'm not very easy even considering the Partito Democratico, the PD, even a centre left party. As Alessandra said, I mean, there's hardly anything left about about the PD. It really is a totally, pro-establishment, pro-globalization, pro-EU, pro-status quo in every sense of the word party, and so it's hardly surprising that it's been it fails to gain traction amongst the working classes and the lower income classes. In fact, the PD's trajectory is similar to the trajectory of a lot of other nominally centre left or social democratic or Labour parties in other European countries, where you have this kind of complete overturning of what were traditional party allegiances. So you have basically centre left parties that increasingly cater almost exclusively to the well-educated, the urbanite, young middle classes, and are progressively abandoned by the working classes. And you have centre-right or conservative parties that increasingly capture the vote of the working classes. And to a certain degree, the same thing. We see the same thing here in Italy, with Meloni and the PD. So if we look at kind of the demographics of the vote, we can clearly see that Meloni does capture a greater part of the working class vote than the PD. The PD hardly captures any any of those votes at all anymore. So there really isn't a a left opposition in the traditional sense of the word. I mean, I would even argue that these terms aren't even helpful anymore in understanding kind of in maneuvering our new political realities, because they really have no they're totally unhinged from what were the traditional meanings of these words, right right and left. I mean, in many respects, a lot of right-wing parties have kind of more, pro-labor proposals and a more pro-labor agenda than nominally centre-left parties. I mean, not so much Meloni, which is very conservative, when it comes to economic policies. But if you look at Le Pen and other parties, so there's definitely this kind of left-right inversion that is happening all over Europe, including in Italy. And for as far as Five Star is concerned, I mean. It'll be very hard, I think, to win back, most of the votes they've lost. I mean, Conte has tried to kind of, regain part of that anti-establishment veneer, but of course, it's for most voters, it's too little, too late. A lot of it's quite clear that for now to reclaim the kind of original anti-establishment roots of the Five Star after having first governed with the PD and then having supported the embodiment of the establishment, which is of course Mario Draghi. For a lot of voters, that's too much to digest, and I think it'll be hard to kind of turn that around.
No, I just wanted to add, I think there are a few, I wouldn't define them as left wing necessarily, but certainly for the Anglo world that believes, I mean, the British Conservative Party is essentially a party of free market fundamentalism. So if they looked at Giorgia Meloni's program, where she has her first point is on incentivizing families to have children by using the power of the state. And another one is she's pro environment. She's pro regulations on the environment. That was another chapter. So she does have certain positions that are more left wing. Another one was called the social state, lo stato sociale, which means protecting the most vulnerable and giving benefits to the most vulnerable, but staying away from the Five-Star movement's universal basic income, which would essentially give everyone an income every month, irrespective of whether they have the potential to be able to work or not. So she does have some positions that I would say in the Anglo world are considered left wing.
Yeah, but there's elements of kind of Hungarian right wing ideology here and there sprinkled. But I think what's interesting about especially from the outside looking in the Italian election, what seemed to be the only conversation was post-fascism, neo-fascism, fascism. It's basically the only conversation that I've been reading on the Italian election. And there's been a lot of these labels thrown around to describe Meloni's background, her roots, her program. So let's try and break it down. What are the Fratelli's historical ties to the remnants of fascist ideology? Is it simply a case that the party has a problematic history, or is Fratelli d'Italia a bit more than just a traditional conservative movement? Starting with Alessandra.
Well, it's certainly true that, thank you for giving me this very hot button question to answer first.
Yeah.
But no,
Good luck.
it's certainly true that Fratelli d'Italia, Giorgia Meloni's party, has fascist roots. I mean, the flame, which is the symbol and the stem of the party, originates from the Movimento Sociale Italiano, which was a post-fascist movement with former fascists who wanted to rebrand or somehow maintain their relevance in the political sphere. So it definitely has fascist roots. That being said, it doesn't mean that it's still a fascist party to this day, and it's sort of hard in this media landscape where everything is binary and you're either a fascist or an anti-fascist to make that sort of nuanced argument. But she has changed in many of her positions. For example, the Italian right wing in its more radical form has always been profoundly anti-American in its foreign policy and anti-Israel. And Giorgia Meloni has, as Thomas said, completely pivoted in that sense. And she essentially now has almost a neoconservative foreign policy, and she's pro, the American empire, and she's pro NATO, and she's even in favor of sanctions on Russia, which is going to be an issue that will be difficult for her to defend this winter when the energy prices will skyrocket in Italy, and the country is already in a dire economic state. So that's just one example of how her views have evolved, and it doesn't make sense anymore to define her as a fascist today. But her party does have fascist roots at the same time.
Okay, well, thanks. That was a pretty good answer to a tricky question. Um, but on this, Thomas, and also maybe perhaps on the way the concept of fascism has been wielded in the campaign, especially on the left, is the accusation of fascism, or especially the accusation that Meloni is a fascist, the fascist party, does that accusation still wield power? Does it still, create some fear that the Duce could be back at any corner, or is this kind of a bit of a tired label?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it really is kind of, I think the same thing goes for the term fascism as goes for terms like right and left. I mean, I think there's, these terms are thrown around all the time, but it's unclear exactly what they mean. I mean, they seem to mean, different things to different people. And so you have, everyone is calling everyone else a fascist. And so you even have people on the right now calling people on the left fascists, and so I think it's a word that has really lost much of its meaning. I mean, I think in its original historical sense, fascism is, is very much dead. No one is considering of, shutting down parliament and instituting a one-party dictatorship, in Italy or elsewhere for that matter. So I think I would be very wary of it. I mean, I think when you use these terms too often, they really lose any meaning whatsoever. So yes, of course, Meloni's party is not fascist in any reasonable understanding of the term, and the problem is that to the left, anything that's that doesn't agree with them is fascist, and so I think that's part of the problem. We're in this cultural war, a context where everything is ultra polarized and becomes and so it's enough. I mean, for a lot of people on the left, I think, Joe, simply to have conservative positions on family and national identity, and then and one's national roots is fascist. But of course, that's not that's not necessarily fascist. I mean, we're having conservative views of family and placing an importance on ideals of the nation and of a country's cultural values is something that, for example, the PCI, the Communist Party in Italy, attached a great importance to throughout post-war history. So it's not something that's intrinsically fascist. And I think a lot of people realize that. I think, by throwing this word around so much, it's really lost meaning in the eyes of a lot of people. And a lot of people realize that it's become an empty word. And in fact, the PD has really tried to ride this kind of fascist threat narrative throughout the campaign, in a very aggressive manner. And clearly the numbers show that, it didn't work. It doesn't work outside of that, small, as I said earlier, upper middle class, well-educated, urbanite, segment of the voters. Outside of that segment, the kind of progressive progressive gang, it really doesn't hold any water anymore, and I think the numbers show that quite clearly. So again, it was a complete blunder for the PD to think that this was going to turn, that throwing around the fascist card was going to turn the elections around. Clearly, that wasn't the case.
Just a bit of an interlude, comical interlude. I'm not sure if you know the filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza. He's kind of a crazy right-wing filmmaker producer, and I was thinking about it because when you're saying the fascist label is losing value, I can't stop reading this tweet, which is just hilarious. If it were truly Mussolini all over again, the left would be celebrating the TAN results. Mussolini was a Marxist and National Socialist. Which I don't know, just kind of is incredibly, I don't know, just everything is wrong about this tweet. But just I was thinking about it when telling me about how even on the right, people are accusing the left of being fascist, and the word has lost a lot of its historical
I think
significance.
people use it nowadays. Essentially, they mean by fascist, they mean authoritarian, and so it's like this word that gets thrown around to say. Even the right uses it against the left when progressives tend to use authoritarian means, then you're a fascist. But originally, that's not the meaning of the ideology.
Yeah. So, leaving the tricky conversation on post-fascism, neo-fascism, and fascism, let's move to the bit of the future. Right now, we have a government, well, not yet, but we're going to have a government between Forza Italia, between Lega, and between Fratelli. How stable is this government going to be? Obviously, the electoral system was made in such a way that they had really strong incentives to bind together and stick together for the campaign. But do they see eye to eye on most issues beyond the kind of electoral incentives? The one example that really came a bit to the light during the campaign was on the Russia-Ukraine war, where it seems that Meloni was much more forceful in her anti-Russian stance, whereas Berlusconi and Salvini had more dovish positions, more kind of traditional right-wing positions on Italy, which is kind of more appeasement and friendlier to Russia. Um, do you see any other issues where the government could be kind of strained because of different positions? Starting with Alessandra.
I think it could be an issue of contention, but not one that would make the coalition fall apart. Hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
we'll survive more than 6 months or a year. But yes, it's definitely an issue of contention because Giorgia Meloni is staunchly in favor of sanctions on Russia.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that very few people discuss for this position that she adopted is that she's part of the European Conservative Party in the EU Parliament, which includes Poland.
Yeah.
So she's essentially a close ally of Poland. And Salvini, on the other hand, is part of a different party in the European Parliament that is allied with Hungary, and Hungary is
Mm.
opposed to sanctions on Russia, and so Salvini is also opposed to sanctions on Russia. I mean, it's something that they will have to resolve. I think. I mean, she has the upper hand, so it might go her
Yeah.
way, anyways. But it's certainly an issue. It's an issue between them and the coalition.
But is it enough of an issue for the whole thing to be unstable, Thomas?
Well, I mean, I think the inner tensions that are bound to emerge within the government coalition, if it comes about as is likely, I think can only be understood, if we take a wider view of Italy's role within the European Union and the euro. It's important, I think, to frame the issue in the right terms, and we're not Italy as part, as a country that's part of the euro. Clearly is much more limited in its economic policy scope than a quote unquote normal country that has its own central bank, that has its own monetary sovereignty is. And I think so the tensions that will emerge, I think, will also emerge in relation to Italy's relation with the European Union in the sense that we know the country is, as a lot of European countries, is heading for what is bound to be a very tough winter, which is going to put a lot of households and businesses in a lot of trouble. And in fact, a lot of them already are experiencing trouble with surging energy bills, and that will require big amount, cushioning the effects of that crisis, of the energy crisis, will require government spending. I mean, there's really no way around it, unless, and that's really the only alternative to the country completely going down the drain. I mean, we're talking, saving Italy, a good chunk of Italy's industrial base, and avoiding a lot of people from falling into, complete poverty requires a lot of money. And for a normal country like, say, the UK, that would be relatively easy, I think, to navigate, even if the parties had different views in terms of what's needed to be done. If you look at the UK, even a fiscally conservative prime minister like Liz Truss has just approved, a pretty big budget. That things are not so easy for a country like Italy. And I think if we look, for example, at the 2018 Lega 5-star government, a lot of the tensions emerged not just because they had different views in terms of what needed to be done in terms of economic policy, but because any more expansionary economic policy inevitably conflicts with the European Union. And in fact, we know that back then the Lega had thought that a high deficit was needed, and the 5-star had a more conservative position. And I think those views are bound to re-emerge. I think we know that Salvini believes in the need for greater deficit spending to cushion the effects of the crisis, while Meloni partly because of her economic views, and partly because she wants to keep the EU on, on good terms, is really kind of pushing back. So I think those are the real tensions that will emerge. I mean, the fact that on the one hand, the government will need to spend a lot of money to cushion the effects of the crisis, but at the same time, I think the European Union will make that very hard for the government to do that. And so, I think the real tensions won't emerge so much within, the coalition. They'll emerge, between the various parties of the coalition and the European Union.
So as we expect a Meloni-led government takes office, do we expect them to have learned cautionary tales from Salvini's time in government? I'm thinking particularly about immigration as one priority area where they were constrained by various aspects of international law. What will be the top priorities for a Meloni government, and what will they have learned from the experience of their coalition partners in government?
Well, I think what Meloni has learned very well is I think she's learned the lesson of the 2018 elections and the resulting quote unquote populist five-star Lega government. She's learned that lesson very well, I think, and the lesson of that government is that there's really that any government that attempts to challenge the kind of the fiscal framework of the European Union, and even more so the kind of overall architecture of the European Union, is bound to suffer very swift and harsh retaliation from the European Union, which is what happened in the case of the 2018 government. And I think, on the one hand, I think that's a very kind of, it's very telling of, I think, the kind of poor state of Italian democracy, where effectively, regardless of who is elected, ultimately the shots are called by Brussels and Frankfurt, regardless of what may be the party's electoral program. So I think Italy is, to a large degree, in my opinion, a post-democracy in this sense. I mean, a country that has almost no economic autonomy whatsoever, and is effectively, conditional on the approval of the European Union for pretty much any form of economic policy, I think is something that we'd be hard pressed to call a democracy, I think. But put that issue aside, I think Meloni understands this context very well, and I think she's learned that lesson very well. That was a government, that came to power with very, quite radical positions, and was really brought to heel very quickly by the European Union. I think that Meloni doesn't want to, she wants to avoid that fate. Clearly, now it's unclear, how you avoid that fate, by any other means other than simply going along with, whatever dictates the EU. Issues, especially when it comes to economic policy. There's a clear contradiction, as I said earlier, between what Italy needs and what the European Union will allow the country to do. And I think that will be a major problem for Meloni, I think, sometime down the road, and maybe, even, just a few months from here, when the crisis really hits this winter. And I think also in terms of other issues, not just economic policy, but immigration and other issues. I think the country is more constrained as part of the European Union, especially the euro, than quote unquote normal countries are. And so I think even those that fear kind of Italy's slide into Hungarian kind of illiberal democracy territory, I think they're overstating the risk, simply because Italy is to a large degree into controlled administration, so to speak, and so I think the government is really very limited in terms of what it can do. Again, Hungary is also not in the euro, and so of course it has much greater freedom in terms of what it can and can't do than Italy can as part of the euro.
Yes, no, I completely agree with what Thomas said. I'd also add that the dependency that Italy has on the European Union has worsened over the past few years, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, because now it's reliant on this recovery fund, and it's the largest fund in Europe that's being given to Italy. So of course, even any remotely Eurosceptic sentiment there was before has essentially vanished now, and this is true for all the parties now in the right-wing coalition.
Just a quick question on the role of the president in Italy. There had been some. We've talked a little bit about the sort of post-fascist accusations against Meloni and her party. Mattarella was re-elected earlier this year. A presidential term is 7 years, but 7 years is a long time to do any job, especially that of president. Is there a possibility? What will Mattarella's role be in the next parliament? And is there a possibility that he resigns before the end of the 7 years? Do you think, Alessandra?
I mean, it's a possibility, but who knows? And it's hard to tell. Thomas?
Well, he is pretty old, so I mean, I think there's a good chance that he might resign. Maybe even by reasons of force majeure. But I think it's not. I think what matters is Mattarella's role will be played in the coming weeks, and it will be the same role that he played in 2018. I mean, the president, even though a lot of people, for a long time, the president's, even though he has a lot of power, for a long time, the president's role was largely, ceremonial to a large degree, and this was very much the case throughout, kind of the Prima Repubblica, so kind of the post-war era up to '92 and beginning of Maastricht. Now, with Italy's joining, entry into the European Union and the euro, the president's role changed very much, and so now, formally, yes, he's the grantor and of the constitution, but in fact, he's the grantor of Italy's international obligations, first and foremost, the European Union and NATO. That's what the role of the president has become. So the president is kind of the guard dog of Italy's kind of supranational rulers here in the country, and so I think he played a very big role, for example, in 2018 in handpicking the individual ministers, and especially most notably the Minister of Finance, which is clearly the most important minister, essentially vetoing the minister that the five-star Lega had chosen because he was considered too Eurosceptic in favor of a much more pro-establishment minister. So I think we're going to see I think he's going to be very involved in the formation of government, making sure that all the major roles are assigned to kind of safe, especially the really important ministries are assigned to kind of safe people, and because the ministers have to be approved by the president. I mean, the whole cabinet has to formally be approved by the president, and so I think he will play a big role. I think in the coming weeks, and probably even in the early months of the presidency, and kind of overseeing the government and making sure it doesn't kind of stray out of line.
For those who remember the very tense 2018-2019 period, when it seemed like Salvini and Five Star were going through a daily trench warfare against Brussels, Meloni's tone on the EU was, I think, quite a stark contrast during this election. It was very non-confrontational. Is this a case of Meloni tactically mellowing her platform to avoid worrying the electorate and, of course, also the market? Or do you think she still has, kind of anti-EU reflexes deep down in her political core, and she's only doing this tactically? And maybe perhaps if she does pick battles with the EU, do you think maybe she'll strategically decide to do it over immigration or rule of law or LGBT questions rather than on budgetary questions, for example? Starting with Alessandra.
Well, so again, this is a sort of, you see on, many newspapers, social media, people saying, oh, is Italy next, leaving the EU after Brexit? This seems to be like almost like that's a possibility for Italy, and it's really not. And she's not aspiring for Italexit or anything like that. She has at the same time, she has criticized the European Union in the way that it functions. She routinely calls out the bureaucrats in Brussels. So she has a Eurosceptic, if you like, sentiment in that regard, but she does not believe in leaving the Eurozone or the European Union. I think she does believe in reforming the European Union in a way that's more beneficial to countries like Italy, or even dissenting countries like Hungary and Poland. That's probably her objective in the long term. But it's not remotely close to what Britain did with Brexit.
There's also, I think, one part of the question which we haven't kind of mentioned so far, which is Meloni's a woman. She's not only the first far-right prime minister, whatever you want to call her, she's also the first woman, well, going to be first woman prime minister. How does she play this kind of the fact she's a woman? How does she play politically? And how does that kind of impact the way you think she'll be ruling, Alessandra?
I think it's very remarkable that she was able to become not just the first female prime minister in Italian history, but also she's the first female leader of a party in Italian history. So she has broken the glass ceiling in that regard. And she also comes from, it's important to point out, from a working class background. She doesn't come from, any sort of privileged background. She doesn't have a higher education. So in that way, she's self-educated. And if you compare her to somebody like Salvini, she's far more articulate and eloquent, I would say, and educated, but self-educated. She doesn't have a higher education, and I think, you know, Italy has still, I think, some archaic views on women, and so for her to reach that position is, like I said, impressive. And yeah, it's really remarkable. And she doesn't have any. She doesn't believe in quotas for women. She doesn't believe in helping women with affirmative action or any of those policies. Having not benefited from those policies herself. I mean, she became prime minister through her own merit, and she probably had to work 10 times harder than her male colleagues. So she has a view on women that simply, women have the right to choose whether they want to be at home and take care of their children or they want to work. It's really up to them. She doesn't take a definite position either way.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. Thanks so much, Alessandra, for this very in-depth and very entertaining explanation of the new state of Italian politics after this parliamentary election this weekend. And to all our listeners, I say to you, see you next week. So, Alessandra Bocchi and Thomas Fazi are both out. It was a really fascinating conversation on the Italian election, and a lot, especially on the relationship between Brussels and Rome, which I think is going to be a key driving factor in the months to come. But one question, actually, which I didn't quite get around to ask, but I think it's something really interesting, is Italy's capacity to be a political laboratory for the rest of Europe. Because when you look at the past, no, I'm not even going to go back over the past century, but if you just focus on the last 15, 20 years, you had Silvio Berlusconi, who was basically some kind of pre-Trump right winger, who started over 2 decades ago, and kind of unique mix of TV figure, I'm a millionaire, everybody can become a millionaire kind of ethos. Then you also have technocratic governments who handle a country which is no longer capable of governing through its traditional politicians. You also have some kind of avant-garde Macronism with Matteo Renzi. He's also still around in Italian politics. We didn't talk about him, but he's still around he did actually decently, I think, with his centrist parties over the weekend. You had Five Star, which is a brand new political object. It's how could you call this? Is a UFO, a UPO, an unidentified political object, which is very hard to define. And then you get Salvini, which is very much the poster child for the kind of new populist right on the rise back in 2017, 2018. So it's a country that seems to be very creative politically. As it also shows, it's also a sign that it's a country that is incapable of choosing, because the reason they're going through all these kind of different political cycles so quickly is because they're not getting any satisfaction. And so the energy Five Star had 4 years ago is now completely gone, because clearly there wasn't much substance to the energy. So yeah, it's quite interesting. It's interesting to see if we're going to get a kind of right wing wave across Europe in the next few months following Meloni's success. I do remember when Salvini did really well back in 2018. It really helped, especially in France. I thought the National Rally was really trying to surf on the coattails of Salvini's successes on the other side of the Alps.
Yes, it's interesting. Italy does always seem to offer a template for other countries, or at least offer a glimpse into the future of what electoral politics might look like. And there are quite a few elections coming up next year in Europe where we might see a similar model of that right-wing coalition essentially being dominated by the National Conservative Party in the country. Czech Republic has a presidential election in early January. Denmark has an election next year. There's some state elections in Germany as well, which will be very interesting to watch, especially given the struggles that have been facing that country. And then Spain at the end of next year as well. So lots of interesting things that Italy could pave the way for. Meloni has already been held up by some conservative commentators as a potential model for how to take the populist strands of the national conservative movement and apply a technocratic sheen, I guess, to it. Unlike with Salvini, who had spent some time in government but couldn't get anything done, there's a perception about Meloni that she might actually be able to deliver on some of the promises that she's making, or at least amongst those who have voted for her and the Fratelli d'Italia. But I don't want to lean too much into that, in part because one of the things that Thomas Fazi pointed out towards the end of our conversation was the low turnout, which is of course indicative of a wider dissatisfaction in Italian politics that really we've seen across much of Western democracy.
Yeah, and Julian is referring to the second part of the interview, which is only available to our Patreon subscribers, where we kind of delve more deeply in the kind of question of EU politics, and the question that Thomas provocatively raises is Italy still a democracy, or is it an appendage of a EU empire? But the paradox, of course, here is, I mean, I'm not going to. I think it's a conversation in itself about the democratic deficit and so on. So I'm not going to go into that conversation today. But again, the paradox is Thomas has this kind of very bleak portrayal of EU politics in Italy, but in reality, if when asked to vote, the Italians decided to vote for moderate parties, or parties which have considerably moderated their stance on the EU. Now, the answer Thomas will give us is yes, but participation has dropped because Italians have lost all hope. Fair enough, but when you look at polls on the EU, I have it right here. 72% of voters want to look to Europe with confidence, and the same percentage believe it is right to remain in the European Union. I mean, it's not a complete plebiscite, but that's a pretty strong number right here. Now, I think the case the Eurosceptics could also make is, well, they don't realize that the EU is limiting their democratic option, but then you're kind of making a strange argument of saying the democratic body of Italy does not know it is no longer democratic. So yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting conversation. I mean, it's definitely a conversation you guys should tune in. There's a real question about Italy and its capacity to govern itself, given its financial situation and the pushback it's been getting from Brussels. But
yeah, I mean, I think whenever we have this conversation about the relationship between sort of national conservative politicians and bureaucrats in Brussels, it sort of glosses over legitimate policy considerations that some of these parties have on a domestic level. So I think one that we could easily point to is immigration as a common flashpoint. It's been 7 years now since the migration crisis really seized the headlines across Europe. We're still waiting for a joint EU solution. So when the Fratelli d'Italia and when Salvini and the Lega propose policies such as a naval blockade of the Mediterranean, it's easy for people to sort of roll their eyes and say, well, that's not practical. But what is the Brussels solution? They've had 7 years and we still haven't seen it. And I'm sure Italians would be all ears to any policy solution on that level. So in terms of the contentious relationship, I think it's easy to say, okay, they might want to challenge Brussels in certain areas and reclaim sovereignty on certain areas. But Brussels has to understand that if they want to be playing a role in sort of binding a European political community together on a number of different policy topics, they actually have to put forward some policy ideas. And if you want to be optimistic about this, Meloni, in blending some of that nationalist and populist rhetoric with overtures towards a more conciliatory approach to foreign policy than, say, Salvini or Berlusconi would offer, is potentially offering a chance for Brussels to reach out and maybe make some progress on these key issues.
I want to actually want to talk a little bit about Hungary here because I think it's relevant. The issue I had with the fight Brussels was picking with Hungary is that it seemed to be kind of a medley of legitimate concerns, especially on corruption and rule of law, and political concerns which should really be up to national governments. You were having the same lot of criticism saying Orban is corrupt, his buddies are getting, his cronies are getting all the money and all the contracts. And at the same time, they'd be saying, oh, he doesn't like immigration and he's more conservative on LGBT rights, for example. And I'm like, this is not the right strategy. If you really want to hammer him on things that even people on the right will be squeamish about, which is, corruption, rule of law, and so on. The reason I think, the reason I was bringing it up with Italy is it seems that a lot of the criticism, take the question of immigration. Question of immigration is really the gift that keeps giving for traditional conservative parties, but also increasingly to populist nationalist parties. And that's really an issue that, I understand the EU has a kind of more multicultural, international identity. But at some point, if you're actually going to be serious about tackling the issue of the rising populist party and rising nationalist parties, surely at some point you have to do that job on immigration. Otherwise, much more unsavory parties will do it instead of you. And I think that's the entire issue at this point. We saw in Sweden, we saw in Italy. Thomas might argue there isn't a profound right-wing shift on immigration, on other issues, but it seems to me that a lot of the conversation going on in Italy was about migrants, about immigration, about insecurity, and so on. And at some point, it feels like it's that the kind of multicultural left is playing with its hands tied. It's not realizing it's giving kind of golden electoral goose to the right to win over and over again. And the solution they're trying to wield for a long time is calling these parties fascist or some kind of allusion to Nazism. And clearly that's no longer working. Boy cried wolf. It's no longer working, no longer has its power. And it's a real issue because when some really unsavory things are going on, those words no longer have a power they should have. And it kind of raises the question of how, as a left-wing party, do you fight against Meloni? Do you fight against Le Pen? Do you have to ape them on those issues, on immigration, on security, or do you have to find a new model? And I don't think that new model is clear.
Yes, and I think you're seeing this pattern across Europe of the attempt to demonize any of these nationalist parties as either a fascist or a racist party, or harkening back to the Nazis, depending on where in Europe you are, it has worked for a time, but as faith in establishment parties has eroded due to cascading crises over the last couple of decades, then the label doesn't work, because on a basic level, the population is looking for competent governments who deliver results on the things that they actually care about. And, we hear Meloni's speeches talking about how she's against gender ideology, but she's pro-family. Now, if you're a columnist in the New York Times, you're hearing that as an assault on potentially on abortion rights or on LGBT rights. But if you're just a voter in Italy, you're thinking that might just mean support for tax credits for families, or encouraging or supporting the nuclear family. On a basic level, as a population, that's a message you can grasp with. But the centre-left, or I won't just say centre-left, I'll say political establishment parties in Europe seem not to recognise that their inability to offer a simple message that is accessible, and instead resorting to demonization of a simple, accessible message, is in fact bolstering some of these other parties.
Yeah, and it's also a one-trick pony. At some point, it doesn't work. I mean, there's only so many times that you can be worried about this kind of unique threat to democracy before people think, okay, well, that's you're not serious. There can't be this kind of unique threat to democracy every fortnight. And I think if you flip the conversation to the right, there's a slightly different issue there, which is traditional establishment centre-right parties are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, clearly the energy comes from this kind of new nationalist populist parties who are driving the conversation, driving the agenda, and you could decide to cut yourself, build a Hadrian's Wall between you and those parties and decide you have nothing to do in common. But electorally, that's kind of complicated. But on the other hand, and this is what happened to Berlusconi and also to Salvini to a lesser extent, if you decide to put your fate with them, your risk of becoming completely marginalized in the junior partner in the kind of larger coalition. So it's not easy. I mean, you have a choice between being sticking to your principles and considering you have nothing to do with the far right, but then kind of also no longer being in power and shape the conversation and shape the country's policies. On the other hand, you have the risk of being completely irrelevant because you got dominated by this new force. On the other hand, some countries, some right-wing parties have managed to do this. Sebastian Kurz in Austria has kind of very tactfully managed to include the far right in his government, but also kind of siphon off their energy quite tactfully, quite masterfully. It doesn't always work. It seems to have slightly backfired in Sweden. It seems to have slightly backfired in Italy for those kind of traditional centre-right parties. It's not an easy conversation for
them. And there was a column I think by Charlemagne in The Economist a couple of weeks ago that talked about how treating some of these parties as untouchables has actually deepened their electoral mystique, and that bringing them into government and removing that sort of cordon sanitaire has in some ways exposed the fact that rhetoric doesn't translate into actions. And, if we're talking about how voters want concrete actions on core issues to them, immigration is one that we've mentioned, but we could also talk about cost of living as another. Coming into government, suddenly it's your responsibility. We saw that with Lega when they were in government with the Five-Star Movement. Some of their credibility dissipated, and that's why the Fratelli were able to emerge, because they weren't able to deliver in government. So if you're and if you're a centre-right government, in some ways, you're looking at these examples and thinking, well, normally I would get diplomatic reprisals for entering government, as Austria did back in 2000 when they were the first to do it, for entering government with sort of the fringe parties. But when they fail in government, you are the voice of sort of competent conservatism, and you can co-opt some of their popular parties, but sort of moving late into the game, as Forza Italia did. You're an outsider on political turf that is well trodden by outsider parties. So I think the attempt to embrace the policy positions isn't necessarily a winning recipe if you're an establishment conservative party. Bringing them into government might be your only way of reestablishing yourself as the competent face of conservatism.
Well, I think that's going to be a wrap for today. Thank you so much for all of you for tuning in on this podcast on the Italian elections. Again, a reminder that you can listen to the full episode by subscribing to our Patreon. You can do it for as little as $5 a month. But you can get even more bang for your buck if you pay $10 a month and join us for a monthly book club, and you'll get a free PDF every month, and it'll be a great opportunity for us to have a great time together and talk about the latest book on European history, politics, culture, whatever. Great. Thanks a lot, Julian. And again, thanks to Alessandra and Thomas for coming on the show. And to everyone, I say to you, see you next week.
Take care.